Thanks. We have one question from our Zoom audience, and we had hoped to get a mic for our Q&A here so that our Zoom viewers can hear your questions. I would ask those of you who wish to ask a question, something terrible, which is to actually get up from your seats and line up to come up to the mic. Sorry. So if you wish to ask a question, please come down this way. But we'll first take a question. Oh, is that our question? Oh, yeah. Okay, we don't have any questions for the audience, but from our Zoom audience. But yes, could you come down, please? Yeah, for the mic. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, you're first.
Am I allowed to?
Oh, we're going to have 10 minutes because we're running late. So
anyway, I'll
keep it short.
Yeah. Okay. So one question for Hobie. Just to clarify can you clarify the process of coming up with the annual padron? Because I got a bit confused when you said that one Spanish Governor General wanted the baptismal registers from the parish priest, but why did he want that when they were supposed to have the annual padron? So yeah. And then for Hana, lovely, fantastic paper. I'm just curious, have the people of that Cainta school appropriated the term sepoys? Because to choose that term for their school paper, well, usually what we call the school paper sometimes exudes the spirit or identity of the school and the people studying there, right? So I'm just wondering if the students themselves, how they felt about that. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for the questions, Grace. The way I'll answer it is that the best work for these processes of registration so far for the Philippines is Mike Cullinane's Accounting for Souls, right? But his work is very 19th century. So we're still in the process of seeing what were these processes like for earlier centuries and how they were standardized. And what we're slowly seeing is that different places have different methods, and it is policies are standardizing these processes in the late 17th century and early 18th century. In this particular case that I described, what is being asked for are counts. So a certification as to how many tributes, and for some reason, it is the local parish priest who is coming up with it. Number one, and number two, I don't know if that practice is valid for other pueblos outside of his parish, right? So it's this process of evolution. This process.
Right. So the question about sepoys appropriation. I have yet to go back on research leave back to the Philippines. So I guess that's something I can go and see if they'll allow me to. When you go into schools, it's difficult. You can't just interview students because of, there are minors and things. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about with regards to the Philippine schools in the Middle East. It's very tricky to actually be able to get the insights of the students. But there are alumni Facebook pages. So I spent a lot of time on social media trying to find anyone with connections to this high school. And yeah, I mean, I think that this identification with sepoys is very much about being rebels, right? So it's part of this kind of revolutionary, like a kind of alternative revolutionary identity. That's not the Katipunan, because there's lots of Katipunan monuments as well in Cainta, but it's interesting that you don't really find sepoy monuments anywhere else, and references to it, and this like desire to want to be identified with, South Asians, whereas, the kind of racial politics of the Philippines, where do South Asian migrants fit? Because they're a very small community as well. And there's like all these kind of racial stereotypes based on vocation. And so I'm not quite sure why there is that kind of disconnect from that. And and then this embrace of sepoys and the South Asian heritage.
Thank you. We have 3 people in line. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have them ask their questions. And then you three are going to answer them like that. So we have about 5 minutes. So yeah, so quick lightning round. Let's go.
Hobby. My question, I'm just fascinated by the parish records, and I just wanted you to tell us a little more about them. Like, where are they? Where you find them? How consistent? Like, what periods are covered? Are there big gaps in the years? More specifically, for the period of the British invasion, do you notice an impact of the war on, marriages, births, and deaths, etc., or would the available records? Would the records be available to tell us more about that period?
Next question.
Thank you to all of the speakers. My question is about to Hana about the Sepoy kind of designation. I mean, for me, the word that I'm a lot more familiar with is Bombay. And that seems to me a much more racial term. And I always wondered why we're more familiar, or many people are more familiar with the term Bombay than Sepoy, and what it might relate to. And there's another thing about the Maglalatik that I'll talk to you about a little bit later, but it's interesting.
Uh-oh. Sounds like you're taking part.
Yeah. Hi, Hannah. I'm Audrey. I'm from Parkbeck. So I'm studying the narratives of Filipino migrants here in London. So there is actually a migrant here who's from Cainta, and then she's familiar with the Sepoy, but she's not familiar with the history of it. So I think this is more of a question/suggestion, because it's really hard to pin down the path to study the Sepoy. So probably one is to look at it on as a cultural marker in a nationalist identity construction. So it is related to how Filipinos look at the Bombay. And also there was a conversation with a migrant from Cainta, something to do with a beauty pageant like the Miss Universe 1994, and then the winner was from India. So it changes, I think, in a certain level, the conversation about the Sepoy and how they look like, because the whiter the person, the beautiful, suddenly it changed. So I think that's one track also to follow when it comes to studying the Sepoy, because they live in the stories of people told among themselves, not exactly in a written document.
Thank you. Last one.
Hannah, could you say something a little bit more?
Closer, please.
Could you say something a little bit more about the caste and class background of the original Sepoys? And also, is there a sense in which the descendants may want to kind of conceal their backgrounds in this particular manner?
Right. Okay. I think I'm going to take the last question first, or you go first, actually. Yeah. Okay. Just before I forget, because that's 3 different things. Right. So in terms of caste and class, I think we've already spoken a bit about during the conference about castas, right? And it having a different kind of history than, say, British caste. But also, I mean, I'm just thinking more about these Sepoys and the women that they married. That it's really hard to trace whether someone is actually a descendant of these Sepoys, because it's matrilineal, because a lot of these men were not Christians. These Sepoys, that they would often take the mother's name because they were common law marriages. So it's something that I'm looking into. Also, I mean, even from my own background, trying to find someone through matrilineal line can be quite tricky, even just going back 100 years, let alone how many centuries, right? And so, yeah, I mean, generally, I think Arya Singh Rai writes about this, that there was immense racial prejudice initially to these men because they are considered outsiders. Cainta is a small community, right, at this time. It's a village compared to other places where it might be easier to recast yourself as something else. But I imagine that, if we do manage to find, some individuals that we might be able to see. So I don't really have any answers there, but this is a time when lots of people could move from one end of the archipelago to the other and then claim that they are something else. I mean, even within the Spanish themselves, like who is considered a peninsulare, you had a lot of like Jewish conversos, right, from who became Christian, new Christians, right, and they end up then when they go to the Philippines, they become peninsulares. But a lot of them, I think, were involved in slave trading as well, and they could do that because they were considered more like dirty by the Spanish caste system in Europe. But it's so the Pacific becomes this kind of cleansing mechanism in that sense. If we think about racial hierarchies and social hierarchies and how they translate in the Philippines. So I think hopefully I answered your question, at least like some leads. Like I think there needs to be a lot of research, more research done on this. Yeah.
No, sorry.
As for sorry, the comments about the Philippine diaspora community. By the way, your work sounds fascinating. It's really cool. And this is something I'm working on now that I'm like past probation at Sussex, that I'm thinking about how to connect more with people who are doing particularly like sociological work in the communities and the Philbrit community. It's interesting what you say about these kinds of changing attitudes towards colorism. And so, yeah, that's definitely like a very contemporary conversation and one that I'm also starting to still kind of jumping into. Because other than, you know, anecdotal evidence from friends who identify as South Asian or, you know, mixed heritage, I'm not a sociologist. I don't even, I can't really speak to that. But thank you for the Miss Universe thing, because that's often where a lot of kind of Filipino racial politics and gender politics plays out in really interesting ways. You know, the Miss, or like the idea of beauty pageants is such an American colonial idea to begin with, right? And so that history, I don't know, again, like we're getting into these like anachronisms, right? Like how people want to be perceived in a particular moment of time, rather than it being about these like historical subpoints. So again, no answers, but just some thoughts. So we can talk later. I'm really interested in your work and you. And the designation about subpoys. Yeah, I mean, it's something, again, I need to do more work on this. And I wasn't expecting to do any work on the sepoys, to be honest. And yeah, I think that there are distinctions to be made between identifying as sepoy and Mumbai. So, and I don't want to say too much about it until I've done the work and thought about it a little bit more. But that in itself could be a really interesting article or chapter. Maybe I'll rewrite this and do that. So.
Thanks. Thanks for the question, Christy. The actual manuscripts are still located in the parishes, except in the case of Northern Mindanao, for instance, which have been rehoused in Xavier University to help preserve them. There have been microfilm and digital copies made through the years, but the restrictions to access to these copies change as our country understandably tries to work out what is fair to all parties, both living and deceased. There are gaps in the years that do happen in these parish registers. One example, for instance, is that case in Bolinao that I mentioned, when they sent the parish registers to the Archbishop to prove their case. Never comes back. It's missing from the record. I think the larger problem is the shuffling of years. So what we've begun to see in the transcription team is sometimes they're missing years, but you'll see them 40 years later. Just the page is torn, inserted elsewhere. And that's something you'll only notice when you transcribe el conjunto, everything. In 60s, we transcribed a few years, but it's difficult to determine the demographic impact of the war without seeing this longitudinally or in comparison with other places that are or not affected by the war. So this 3 years that I have, it's not enough, unfortunately. But hopefully, eventually, we'll be able to get to an answer for that. And but one thing that is interesting, I think, is that in times of crisis, we should think of these registers not as existing alone, but there are indications in these parish registers that there are other pieces of papers and sometimes other notebooks that are being done. Like very quickly, he'll make these notations and then transfer them later on when he has more time, seems to be what is happening. We don't have these other notebooks, but they're referenced. So they must exist, hopefully, somewhere. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and just throw in an observation to which the panelists need not reply. And that is, all three of you brought up images as part of the engagement with your particular topics. For instance, the maps and the copper plates that the Castellanos, the Castellans of Cavite were in charge of. This was part of their work, the making of the imagery and the recording of plans and maps and so on. And you mentioned the marginalia in these records, those drawings, which in medieval manuscripts in Europe are considered, a sort of a subconscious of the illustrator. And finally, that image of the sepoy, which is in fact an unauthored, anonymous painting in the National Army Museum dating around 1900, which has no origin and has no end, it would seem. But it is used for these purposes of fixing or indexing identity in the Philippines. Thank you very much. That was a fascinating panel. You will now have coffee. You're dying for it. You're gagging for it. And we'll give you until 10 after the prescribed time. So please come back at 3:40. Thank you very much.
Yeah.